Good evening and welcome to Iowa News and Views. My name's Joe Balcom. I'm the host of the program. I'm a county supervisor over here in Johnson County, and it's a pleasure to be with you. Iowa News and Views is a community affairs program that's been organized over the course of the last couple of months by people around the state of Iowa that are interested in seeing more discussion about state and local affairs on our TV stations. And so this program is essentially being brought to you by a variety of volunteers around the state. I'd like to thank our volunteers and our local sponsors in the cities that this show will appear in over the course of the next few weeks. Iowa News and Views is a 30-minute program that'll be broadcast every week throughout the state of Iowa in about 20-some communities. In addition to the program where we hope to talk about community affairs, we will be giving some information later in the show about an internet discussion forum that we have also organized to incorporate the ideas of viewers and people around the state to kind of begin to talk about some of the topics we hope to raise in the show and to communicate about those things. I'd like to give a bit of a disclaimer at this point. The public access provider that you're seeing this program on is not responsible for the content of the program. I'm responsible for what I say, and our guests are responsible for what they say. In everything, you'll hear things on this program, and you may agree or disagree with some of those things. I'm sure I will, but we'd like to hear your feedback about what we're up to. Tonight's show, we're going to have a discussion about corporate welfare in the tax system in Iowa, and with us tonight are David Osterberg. David heads up Osterberg Consulting. It's an environmental and labor public policy consulting firm. David also teaches part-time at the University of Iowa. He is, in addition, a former state legislator from Mount Vernon. Also with us is Peter Fisher. Peter is Associate Professor of Urban and Regional Planning here at the University of Iowa. Let's get right to the report. David, this report was put together by the Iowa Federation of Labor and the United Auto Workers of Iowa. You and Peter both worked on this report. Why this report now? What's going on here?
Well, I think that this is a good time to have a report like this. At the first week in February, Representative Kasich, the budget chair in the House, got together with Ralph Nader, of all people, to begin to talk about corporate welfare and how to reduce it at the federal level. Our report, which is dated January of 1977, was not to try to get rid of corporate welfare. It was rather to measure it. How much are we talking about? How much does the state of Iowa give to businesses in the form of direct expenditures and in the form of tax breaks? And we simply thought it was high time that somebody measure this and try to show how much it is so that policymakers could then make decisions on it. Mm-hmm. We found that it was close to $1 billion a year. Most of that is tax expenditures. But the direct expenditures, things that are given to corporations every day in Iowa, is nearly $200 million.
By comparison, in looking at the welfare system that we're in the process of reforming now in Iowa, it appears through the report and seen other places that we're spending about $49 million a year on direct payments for family investment program and a few other programs. There seems to be a lot of public scrutiny about those issues. And in reading the report, it's very complex. I mean, the tax system is obviously very complex. Do you think that this report is going to get the kind of scrutiny that the welfare system for individuals has been getting?
Well, you'd expect it. It's so much larger. I mean, if you look at what the direct payments for what we generally call welfare, and that is generally a woman with a couple of kids, that in Iowa is about $50 million in direct expenditures. If you wanted to add on the Iowa share of Medicaid, keeping people healthy, that could be as much as another, about the same amount. Mm-hmm. Biggest amount, $100 million. 1/10 of the amount we give to corporations mm-hmm. and businesses. Or you can look at it as the $50 million of direct payments compared to the $200 million of direct payments. Again, a very small amount in relation, and yet we put incredible scrutiny on that $50 million, and the scrutiny we found that is put on The corporate part of welfare is very, very slight.
Sure.
I don't think anybody knew exactly how much it was. When I was associated with state government, no one ever showed me that anyone had added up just what we were giving away. As far as Peter and I know, this is the first time this has been done in the state of Iowa.
Mm-hmm. Peter, there's in the report we talk about direct payments and we talk about tax expenditures, things that don't require us to write a check to somebody to get that benefit. Can you describe a little bit about the difference between those two things?
Sure. Yeah, those are the two major components of what we call corporate welfare, and I think what most people are referring to when they use the term corporate welfare, which is a term, incidentally, that's used everybody from former Labor Secretary Robert Reich to very conservative organizations like the Heritage Foundation. And it's meant to capture two things: the actual programs that involve direct payments by government, federal, state, or local, to businesses, and tax breaks or tax expenditures. And they're lumped together, I think, because the tax break is really an expenditure program in the guise of a tax cut. And I think the best way of explaining that is just give an example of two different ways that we might want to support or subsidize, say, new business investment in the state of Iowa. If we wanted to spend $50 million to encourage investment in plant and equipment, we could raise taxes or cut programs somewhere else and come up with $50 million and parcel it out in grants directly to the corporations. Or we could say, instead of giving you money, we're simply not going to collect it in the first place. So where we would have collected $200 million in taxes from this set of businesses, we'll only collect 150. But the effect is exactly the same. The businesses have $50 million more than they did before, and the state has to come up with $50 million in tax increases somewhere else, or $50 million in program cuts. So a tax break of that kind that's targeted at a very specific subset of the taxpayers is really like an expenditure program and needs to be evaluated as such.
Great. There was an article in the Des Moines Register a couple weeks ago that Mark Smith wrote, the Secretary of the Iowa Federation of Labor, discussing some of his concerns, and he noted in that, and the report notes as well, is that not all of these tax programs are necessarily bad, that some of them meet some public policy objectives that are to our benefit and that we ought to support. There's a number of those in the report as it talks about the direct payment system. One in particular is cleaning up leaking underground storage tanks. There's another program that spends money on landfill alternatives. Of those programs, do we have a way to evaluate? I have a gut feeling which ones I think are important. Is there a way really to evaluate those?
Well, remember, this report is not to be critical of the total amount. We're just simply measuring it. And as Joe said, I'm a former state legislator, and when I was, I worked hard on getting underground storage tanks cleaned up. Not that we're against doing these kind of things. Rather, we want decision makers like state legislators to know how much it is in the first place, so when they begin to decide that they ought to make tax cuts to businesses or more grants to businesses, first of all, find out how much we're already giving. Yeah, I think that we might spend a little bit too much money on cleaning up underground storage tanks. Mainly, it's a subsidy to business. What it says is, we want to get these things cleaned up. We want to get them cleaned up fast. We're not going to fight about whose responsibility it is. The state's going to pay about 80% of all the problems that were caused by these businesses. To get it done, we're willing to pay most of it as a state. And I think that that's probably a good thing to do. We might argue about whether it ought to be a 50% or 80%, but that it needs to be done is not in question. But each time you evaluate these questions, you ought to know what's been done before. And my reading of it is legislators and decision makers don't necessarily know how much is already being given before they start talking about doing more for business.
Well, it's as I mentioned a moment ago, it's a very complicated set of issues. I deal with a county budget, and we're in the process of doing that now, and tax levies and a variety of different funds, and it's a complicated document. At the state level, it's obviously much more complicated. If we were going to take on a more comprehensive look at this, Peter, who would do the work? Who would compile this? It seems like legislators are probably overwhelmed.
Well, in other states, it's done by the Department of Management or the equivalent, or a Department of Revenue. Over 20 states do a tax expenditure study every year where they look at every feature of every state tax and look at who, or at least the total amount given away through that special tax preference or tax break. So it's something that can be done and is done by a lot of states. It has not been done in Iowa.
Go ahead.
And on the expenditure side, it's something that could be probably more easily done even than on the tax side.
Yeah, I think it's good to compare those two, because the way the budget process works, when something is being given out, whether it's being given out to poor people or to companies or to the environment, you have a budget that you talk about and fight over. A lot of attention is given to the direct payments. The stuff that Peter's talking about, the tax expenditures, are below. Right. You never come back and ask every year whether or not you ought to be continuing to make that expenditure, because it's just automatic in the fact that we didn't get as much tax money as we normally would have. So by having a tax expenditure like these 20-some states do, you would at least have that more on the table to begin to talk about it. That's why I think that's one of our recommendations that's very important.
So by way of tax expenditure, and looking at the list, there's a variety of sales tax exemptions for raw materials and production of certain goods and certain goods, transportation services. There's some professional business services. If a business uses a lawyer, they don't have to pay taxes on that. There's a variety of those things, and those are just, you're saying those are just built in. They're not a dollar amount. We're not writing a check as a state, but those are just built into the system. There's another one for meals and entertainment. That's some $4.7 million a year that we give adjustments on. It's amazing how many different areas that we have developed around this tax code. I assume this is over many years of adjustments here.
They accumulate. They just build up over the years. They're never scrutinized pretty much once they're enacted, and yeah, they just tend to pile up, and that's, I think, one of the reasons why we wanted to do this, is to see, you know, after all these years, what have we done? What have we created here? What's the total look like?
Well, I know the state a couple of years ago gave some fairly significant tax packages to the IPSCO Steel Company when they came into Muscatine, and there's a lot of concern about that. That would probably maybe be an example of where we went too far, perhaps. We're also now, there's a turkey plant over in West Liberty that's being taken over by producers, turkey producers in that part of the state. And the state is getting involved to keep those jobs in West Liberty and providing support. That seems to be the kind of investment in communities that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I distinguish between those two. I think that, but part of it is, and I think many other people would make a distinction between those two. But in order for people to let their elected representatives know that they like one and they don't like the other, they have to know what they are.
Sure.
So most of this report is simply a public's right to know. We're asking that there be more information given to people on how much taxes are being paid by corporations, what kind of tax breaks they're availing themselves of, and we have that right.
Okay. We'll take a little break here. This is Iowa News and Views you're watching at the moment. I'm Joe Balcom. We're here today with Peter Fisher from the University of Iowa and David Osterberg from Osterberg Consulting. They've just recently completed a report on corporate welfare in Iowa that we're talking about. The report's been criticized by, in some of the press reports, by some of the Republican leadership, Brent Segrist and Ron Corbett. They called it a partisan document and suggested that there are a lot of benefits being provided by these tax breaks to corporations. They've created more jobs, they've created more income, and more wealth has been created. How do they know that? And in terms of the things that are in this report, it sounds like we don't have a lot of accountability.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the point. We were not trying to evaluate these programs. We weren't saying they aren't accomplishing anything. We're saying we need to take a look at them. We need to at least start collecting the information we would need to determine how effective they are, which ones are most effective, where we want to be putting our money. It's really a question of fiscal responsibility, which I think any legislator ought to champion.
They were indicating, also was indicated that most of the benefits are given away at the local level. That's, I guess, a whole nother area of out there that it appears we don't have a whole lot of information. What's there to know? What don't we know about what's going on at the local level?
Well, it's different trying to gather the information Peter and I did at the state level and the local level, because the state is kind of a central repository for all this stuff. But if we had to go to Cedar Rapids and then Council Bluffs and then Mason City and each of these places to try to find out some of the same information, it would be a much bigger question, much bigger problem, and we just couldn't have done it in the time we were allotted. Yeah, Brent Segrist, I've served with him. He's a smart guy, but obviously he didn't read the report when he made a comment, because he said most of it's local. We think a lot of it's local. There's nothing local in this report.
Right.
We limited it to what the state was doing. There's sort of a preface that talks about a recent Cedar Rapids package that was put together, and in that I talk about some of the stuff being local. But besides saying this is how big the thing is, when we began to measure it, we took out the local section and only talked about the state part. So Brent was way off base on his comment.
Well, the question of job creation is a real basic measure of how we're doing, and perhaps another measure would be how well we're doing in income in Iowa, how our income's doing over time. And I noted recently that Iowa ranks 42nd in income nationally. How do are these things related? The fact that on one hand people are saying we need to provide these corporate subsidies in order to get better paying jobs with benefits and the like, or are we not getting our money's worth?
Well, I think
is there a way
to
measure that?
Yeah, I think the point that Mark Smith made in his editorial is the right one, is that if there's a public purpose here to be served in creating more employment in Iowa, we at least ought to be using our public funds in a way that raises the average wage in the state, raises incomes, and not using public funds to subsidize businesses that are in effect lowering the average wage. And that's not an issue that we got into in this report, but I suspect it's a way of looking at things that most people would agree with. But we don't know really how these programs are performing on that dimension.
David, a few moments ago you said you equated this report with the basic fundamental notion that people have a right to know, taxpayers frankly have a right to know how their tax money's being given out. The report makes a number of recommendations about that in terms of developing some tracking and some performance measures. What needs to happen next?
Well, what needs to happen is for the legislature to take this seriously. And so far, there's been a bit of press in both the Cedar Rapids Gazette and in the Des Moines Register on this report. We met with the editorial board in both of those papers and found them very interested, very responsive. We'd like to see some of that same kind of response coming out of the state legislature. We think that they ought to look at this and not just sort of reject it out of hand, call it partisan, and therefore we're not going to look at it. The point is, it measures something, and no one has shown us that we've measured it wrong. If there is this amount of money being given away every year in the state of Iowa, nearly $1 billion, then the state legislators, I think, have the obligation to sit down and look at it and then make some decisions about whether more accountability is needed, that they ought to consider this before they decide to give more tax breaks. And right now, much of the argument over giving away a very large tax break is for business development. They don't know yet how much business development there has come from all of these things. It may be that because of all of this that exists now, what the state can get out of a very large tax break to businesses may not be much at all. They ought to ask the questions, and we'd be happy to help them with those questions.
So it sounds like the report, although it casts the welfare light on corporations, and I'm sure that friends in the corporate world are not real thrilled about that kind of analogy, that we are saying that there are some programs out there that we need to know more about if we can, if we're going to be able to analyze their effectiveness. And it's not to say that we're here tonight saying that all corporate subsidies are a bad thing. I think we're not saying that. I think we're saying we need to have a better handle on how we're investing our money to be able to evaluate that.
You know, like a lot of other things, this is a simple question.
Mm-hmm.
We just posed a very simple question to say how much is there, and we made our best effort to try to measure how much there is. That, I think, requires some kind of a response, because it's a question that nobody had asked yet and no one had demonstrated.
Mm-hmm.
We think we've done that, and we sure would like to see something happen, a next step in the state legislature. So far, there isn't one.
So is this the kind of thing that we will see some reform of when the state gets into tough financial position where they're going to need some of that money back? I mean, we're working on our county's budget now, and I can tell you it's a tight one. You know, all this talk of tax cuts at the federal level and the state level. We need money at the local level. People want us to do more with what we have and provide more services, and we're looking for money. And sometimes I think the same to the state. We're flush right now, and maybe there's less interest in really taking a hard look at how some of these dollars are apportioned. I guess I just wonder about that. It's a complicated issue, and it's going to take some real commitment from some of our leaders to get into this, it seems to me.
Well, some people think there's a relation between the state being flush and the counties not having good money at all, because the state has clamped down on what the counties are able to do. At the same time, they've built up this very large surplus, which they then, instead of helping counties out, are going to give it back to taxpayers. Now, I'm not totally opposed to doing that, but boy, I'd sure like to know which taxpayers are getting it back, and why we should try to give it back in such a way that we benefit the same kind of people who are the owners of these companies who are already getting huge tax breaks. Ought to be a question.
Well, the question of who benefits and who pays is a very important one that's out there, and your report has raised a lot of interesting questions. It's a huge area, almost $1 billion worth of subsidies. In reading the report, and we'll give some information in a moment here on how you can get a copy of the report, it leaves a lot of unanswered questions about what kind of benefits we're getting for this kind of investment. I'd like to thank you both. We're getting to the end of our program here. I'd like to thank you, David and Peter, for being with us tonight and sharing your report with us. In the coming weeks, hopefully we'll see some more debate at the legislative level about this report. You'll have it in a second or two. We'll have on the screen a number with the Iowa Federation of Labor on how you can get a copy of it. Next week's show is coming up. We will be having a discussion of the current debate in the state of Iowa around parental notification. Also, at the end of the show, the credits will have some information on how you can get in touch with Iowa News and Views. I want to know how you like the show, how we can make it better. So send us your thoughts. We'll give you an email address, and we also have a web page up that has a lot of information about who's involved and why we think this is an important project, as well as a phone number and address if you'd rather contact us that way. We really do want your ideas. Send us your email. In addition, as I noted at the beginning of the show, we're also encouraging you to sign up on an Iowa News and Views email discussion group, which will hopefully link Iowans from around the state to discuss show topics and any other issues that you think are important to the state of Iowa and your local communities. I'd again like to thank all our local sponsors around the state who have made it possible for these shows to be airing in your community. I'd like to thank, in addition, some of the folks that have contributed financially to the show. And of course, I'd like to thank our crew here tonight that have helped produce the show. And certainly like to thank the viewers for tuning in. We'll be on next week, same time, same place. To remind you to set your VCR, program your VCR. This is a show you want to catch. And just remember, this is just a TV show. What's really important is what you're doing every day in your local community to make it a better place to live for you and your family and your neighbors. So with that, I'm Joe Balcom, and this has been Iowa News and Views.